Good afternoon. I'm Ken Cross and I'm running for the office of President of the United States. The topic of today's video is taxes, a fair and sensible approach. Looking at the polls, most people do not consider taxes as very high in the list of subject matter that they are interested in, which is hard to understand to some extent in that the tax rates are what determine what a person's take-home pay is to take care of their family's needs and to handle their financing. So I think the reason that people don't really get interested in taxes too much is that most tax plans are very complex, too complex, and they just kind of go with the hope that the tax plans are reasonable and sensible. Um, the tax plan that I have is easy to understand. It's my graduated flat tax plan for individual income. There is 4 total tax rate levels in my plan, a total of the graduated tax levels. The first level is zero tax on the first $20,000 of income for everybody. There's no reason that we should have a system where there's one large bureaucracy collecting taxes from people who earn $20,000 or less, only to have another large bureaucracy of government provide monies back to the same people in the form of welfare assistance like food stamps or housing vouchers, and then also have the money returned at tax time. So we can do things much better, much more simply. And the first step is to make it such that that my plan is that there's zero tax for everybody on the first 20,000. Someone might ask, well, you can see why there would be zero tax for the very poor, but why would there be zero tax for a millionaire with your plan? Don't be concerned. In my higher levels, the millionaires will pay a fair share, uh, just like everyone else. But for simplicity, we want to have the plan be able to be understood. So this is very easy to understand. No tax on the first 20,000. A household in America is made up of 2 individuals, usually 2 adults, and maybe a child on average. So if there were 2 people in the household earning 20,000 each, the household income would be 40,000 and they would pay no tax. So it's a very good plan for the working poor. The next rate in my tax plan is 10% tax on the range from $20,000 to $100,000. That $100,000 would be around the top end of the middle class, so that no one in the middle class would pay more than a 10% rate on that 80,000 from 20 to 100. But the effective rate would actually be less, because since they would pay 0 on 20, 10% on the 80,000 from 20 to 100, 10% of 80,000 is 8,000. So the amount a person making $100,000 would pay in tax would be $8,000. 8,000 divided by the 100,000 is an 8% effective rate. No one in the middle class would pay more than an 8% effective rate. The third level of my plan is a 20% tax rate on income between 100,000 and 200,000. Again, the people would only be paying the 20% on that amount over 100,000. They would still have zero taxes on the first 20. They would have 8,000 taxes up to the first 100,000, and then 20% of that amount over 100,000. So even an individual earning $200,000 would really be paying an effective rate of 14%, not 20%. The fourth and last level of my tax plan would be a 30% tax rate on income amounts over $200,000. Some athletes, entertainers, and business people earn $20 million a year, which is okay. We're in a free enterprise system, and people are allowed to earn as much as they're able to do so based on their skill sets and talents. I just believe that they should be willing to pay a fair share of that amount in taxes for appreciation of living in a society that enables them to have that much money and to keep most of it. The effective rate, even if it was 30%, uh, which all rates would be a little less because they're blended with the lower rates. But let's assume it was 30%. The tax on 30%, with a 30% tax rate on $20 million is $6 million, which is indeed a lot of money for one person to pay. However, the amount left after paying federal income tax, it would be 20 million minus the 6 million would be 14 million. And 14 million is indeed a lot of money too. I've never had that kind of money, but I'm sure that I could live on 14 million a year, and I'm sure that you could too. The point is that there's enough money there, plenty enough for a person with $14 million after tax to enjoy any aspect of life they would want to enjoy without depriving them, and still enable them to contribute to our country and provide revenues that prevent us from going into a dangerous debt situation. I would refer you to my video on federal debt to follow further on that. The current top tax rate now in the United States is 39.6% and has been as high as 90% in our history as a nation. So my 30% top rate is not unreasonable at all. The difference is that with my 30%, I have eliminated most of the loopholes, loopholes, credits, and deductions. Sorry. Let me say this first before I go on. The rich people in this country are not our enemy, as some have suggested. I've known a lot of them. They work hard. They create jobs. They pay most of the taxes, as I just discussed. They enable welfare to the poor to be paid. The poor have nothing. That's why they're getting welfare. The money comes from the government. The government has the money because someone is paying taxes in, and the rich people are the ones paying most of the tax. Also, they are generous, and there are many that are generous, but just a few as an example. I read recently that Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett were talking about setting up to 50% of their wealth for charitable purposes. And it's true, they have way more than they need to live on, but still, out of their creativity, ingenuity, their efforts, they accumulated this mass and they do share. So we are fortunate to have in this country with a free enterprise system people who are able to create such wealth so that we can derive the benefits of their efforts in the wealth that they create. This is how my graduated flat tax plan works. The federal income tax on wages, tips, and other sources of income are held by employers just the same way they are now, and then sent to the government. Interest on dividends and interest and dividends are taxed at 10%. Taxes are withheld by banks and brokerages, and they are sent to the federal government. So the reason we do that is we're developing here a method that most people would not even have to file an income tax form. So by the banks and the brokerage houses sending that money in to uh, the government then has that money, and then the first, after a calendar year ends, the first $10,000 by my plan of combined interest and dividend income is returned by the IRS. So that almost everyone would get a check because they derive some interest back from the IRS instead of having to worry about paying the IRS or some sort of penalty. Some would derive a little bit if they had not much interest in dividends, and some would derive quite a bit of benefit. Short and long-term capital gains would be taxed at 15%, sent to the IRS by brokerage houses. The brokerage houses would also send capital losses to the government and to their investors. And at the end of the calendar year, again, the government would take the 15% of capital gains that was paid in, look at, reduce the amount of debt, of taxes due by the short-term losses and long-term losses, and pay the investor back the difference. The only way that the low tax rate percentages of the graduated flat tax can work is that almost all loopholes, including deductions and tax credits, are eliminated. However, contributions into a Keogh type retirement account would remain to make sure people are encouraged to save enough money to cover their expenses when they're older. And people would then be able to withdraw that money at retirement age tax-free. I will now comment about some popular deductions and tax credits that would be eliminated. First, remember, with my plan, there is no tax on the first 20,000, 40,000 on a household basis, 10% on 100,000, which is just 8,000. So to get those kind of low rates, we have to give up some of the complex and monumental types of tax approaches and dividends and credits that have been developed over the years. One of them would be the standard deduction. We need a standard deduction. We just pay the low rates of my graduated flat tax plan. The mortgage interest deduction, very popular. I've owned a house most of my adult life. I've deducted that interest, and it's been enjoyable to see my taxes reduced based on that. One problem with the mortgage interest deduction that I always had, even when I was taking it, was it is a fundamentally unfair tax advantage. Right now, some singer or actor or someone very wealthy could buy a house in Beverly Hills, and they do, and they deduct hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions in interest expense from their taxes by owning that palace type of house. And yet, many working poor in the country simply cannot buy a house at all. They don't have enough money for a down payment. They aren't earning enough to be able to make the monthly payments. So they live in apartments and they rent. Well, when you have a mortgage tax deduction for a certain element of society and they are exempted from taxation, and you don't from somebody who is not exempted, those who are not exempted are essentially subsidizing the others. Something is wrong with the working poor who can't afford to buy a house, subsidizing people that can buy houses in Beverly Hills. The concept is not a good concept. It's very popular because people paid less taxes. That would be eliminated with my tax plan because keeping with the simplicity of my plan. A more probably controversial one is charitable deductions. First, I'd like to say that people gave to charities long before the federal income tax was ever even created in 1913 with an amendment. So the idea that people would only give if there was a tax benefit is a flawed concept. For another reason that I'm not for the charitable deductions is that I know they're greatly abused. They require great bureaucracies to try to determine the real worth of things contributed. There are unquestionably cases where someone contributes a painting, let's say, to a museum that's worth 100,000 but writes off a million. Even on a very much smaller basis, I went to Goodwill yesterday and gave a lot of things that I didn't have use for to them. And when I left, the worker there named Steve said, "Well, would you like a contribution slip?" And you know, I didn't need those things I was contributing. It shouldn't be the reason that we get the slip, that we give those things in the first place for charity. I know they're abused as well. I myself have given to places and they pass out the slips and they say fill in the amount. All of this brings out the worst in our character. When we contribute, we should just contribute out of our own sincere desire to help some people or peoples. Uh, there are many religions in our country, which is a wonderful thing. It's the first country that we have. I personally go to a Southern Baptist church here in Batesville, and am of a Christian faith. There are many in our country who are Christians. I'm strong in my faith, and I study the Bible because of my faith. Matthew 6, chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, Christ is talking, and he says these words. I don't know if I'm going to quote exactly, but he says, "When you do your charitable deeds, do not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. Do your charitable deeds in secret, that your Father that see in secret will himself reward you openly." The point there is that where have we gotten to the point where we don't follow the person's instructions, clear, simple instructions, to give secretly and without fanfare, and yet we have our own federal government in the process of dealing what we give or don't give. I get the feeling that if Christ were here himself, he would be puzzled and say, "What is it about my teachings you can't understand?" So I am not for the charitable deductions. I've talked to some religious leaders who maintain that if we took away the charitable deductions, the churches would all collapse and go under. I don't believe the money is the reason some churches are struggling. I believe that they've placed the priorities in the wrong place, and if they stressed the faith stronger, they wouldn't have to worry so much. What we need is for the religious leaders to have more faith, and that the people will give anyway. Moving on, the earned income credit and the child tax credit would have to go. I read in an article that said that those credits helped reduce the children's poverty rate to 16.7%. That's still too high. But we can reduce poverty in other ways other than tax credits. Shame on us if we do not. With my jobs plan, every able-bodied person would be able to find work. See my jobs video, please, to see my plan there. Here are some of the benefits of my graduated flat tax plan. For one, it's simple. Two, there would be lower taxes for most middle income taxpayers. taxpayers. Most people would not have to file an income tax form. The marriage penalty would be eliminated because every person would be treated separately and individually. Makes no difference if in a household, if there's a married couple or engaged couple or just a couple of friends just living together sharing expenses. It's not the government's business what people do with their personal lives. If you make some money, you pay a certain amount of tax on that money. And so the marriage penalty is eliminated. And more importantly than the other ones, I believe, is the impact of lobbyists is greatly reduced. If you establish a simplified plan and stick with that plan, then there is no incentive for great flows of money into congressmen's and presidential candidates' campaigns to try to get certain favored tax treatment. So I think that would be a better feature of a simpler plan. I have a comment to make about the other major candidates about their tax plans. Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump all have tax plans that would reduce national revenues by trillions of dollars over the next 10 years. The Tax Reform Center projects that Hillary Clinton's tax plan would actually increase revenues over the next 10 years. However, the Tax Reform Center said that Hillary has a forthcoming proposal to cut taxes for low and middle income families. After she releases her proposal, her tax plan may reduce national revenues by trillions of dollars also. I want to speak a little further than this. I've decided to go a little deeper relative to the the other candidates. First, with Bernie Sanders, we have an individual who believes in socialism, and this is at a time in history when the Chinese are implementing what they call reforms to have free enterprise to stimulate their economies and be more like us. And they're doing that all over the world with countries that have been historically socialistic. Russia is increasingly going to more private ownership. And as I said, the Chinese are setting that as a deliberate objective to have less government involvement and less government ownership of business. So, the idea that we are going to move toward socialism is a bad idea, and especially it would cost, by some estimates, up to $15 trillion in reduced national revenue at a time that we can't afford that kind of loss of revenue. Please see my federal debt video again. The Tax Reform Center, no, I will move on. That's Sanders. Okay, next is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has a 10% flat tax across the board, which is very simple. The only trouble with that is that a person making $10 an hour would pay $1 and have $9 of disposable income. A person of $100,000 would pay 10% of 100,000 is 10,000, but they would have lots of disposable income left. I've lost some of them this year, so I'm going to have to rethink this. But the point is, 10% across the board does not cover for higher incomes paying a higher percentage. An example of what I want to say is that in the military, if you raised everybody in the military's pay by 10%, a private earning $10,000 would get a $1,000 raise. A general earning $200,000 would get a $20,000 raise. Instead of paying $21,000 to give the general $20,000 more, which is all above what he needs for housing and food, and giving the private $1,000 to try to deal with expenses. If I were to give $5,000 to each of them, that would be $10,000 less than half the 21, and it wouldn't be on a percentage basis. So doing things on the percentage basis, as Ted Cruz has done, is very favorable to the very wealthy. He has another plan he's put forward of a value-added tax, which along the line of being manufactured, things are taxed a percentage, sometimes 20% or so, which raises the value of goods that reach the retail market, for example. So in that value-added environment, the very poor pay the same price for that loaf of bread, if it is that they're buying it, as a multimillionaire. And if those are the only types of taxes, then that's very inequitable. So Ted Cruz's plans are bad. They have a $1 trillion projected deficit. I mean, they have a $13 trillion deficit over 10 years is what some analysis has been done by a tax plan firm. So then on Donald Trump, Trump is projected to be 11 trillion in 10 years lost revenue. Trump's plan is very questionable. He says he tends to want to leave Social Security and Medicare alone. That plays well to the elderly. Says he wants to beef up the military. That plays well to the military. Wants to improve, improve infrastructure. All of this with cutting taxes aggressively, and the math just doesn't work. And the thing of it is, I'm not the only one that knows that. The economists know that, and it's time for the economists to step up and newspapers to start indicating that some of these plans are just plain very flawed. So we've covered Sanders, Cruz, and Trump, and now with Hillary Clinton, I mentioned that earlier. Her tax plan taxes the rich very high, doesn't do much for the poor or middle class, but it doesn't put us in a more accelerated rate toward debt crisis if she doesn't bring forth another plan to help the poor and the middle class. It's a nice idea, but we need to know what her plan is, not after she gets elected president. Again, these people need to put out their plans in detail so we can determine that which is facetious and that which is reasonable. I'm eager for the Tax Reform Center or any other analysis organizations to address my graduated flat tax plan to determine how my plan compares with the Democrats and Republicans' plans. I'm convinced that the math in the rough calculations I've done is that my plan is far superior to the country and far less detrimental. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.